Meet Joe Romm. On April 6th, he wrote an article that could best be described as a cherry-picked non-sequitur strawman fabrication against new nuclear developments and innovation. Consider for instance the title. Does nuclear have a negative learning curve? Which in itself is a perfectly fine question. However, which nuclear? In what country? Romm likes to hone in on a handful of cases in the US, UK, France and Finland, as if they are the norm. But these are outliers. Also note that there are a million ways we can do nuclear, as Kirk Sorensen from Fly Energy once said. And so far, the most widely commercialized reactor concept is the light water reactor. Even the advanced Generation 3 EPR and AP1000 that stand trial and, according to Romm, represent the entire nuclear industry. Besides, he ignores other countries or dismisses them as being no free market economy, which is yet another illogical statement. It does not logically follow that if something is temporarily expensive thanks to reversible misunderstanding, that it has run out of its usefulness to us. Nuclear certainly has a big role to play in the years to come when climate change damage mitigation and economic growth are required. In fact, analyses of molten salt reactor experts show that a cheap future for new nuclear energy is expected.
The United States, where we're very concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, uses about 20% of the world's energy today. So if we were to cut our CO2 emissions to zero, we'd still have to worry about the other 80%. And the other 80% is growing at a tremendous rate as these nations develop. So we'd have almost no effect of zeroing our own CO2 emissions. Not only do we need to have a source of energy that is CO2 free, we must also be able to export it and install those kinds of power plants in all the nations around the world. And the only way to do that is to make them inexpensive enough that all the nations of the world would rather have them than their existing coal plants.
Aside from that, I wonder whether Romm bases his assumptions on the notion that the failures we see today were the only bets the nuclear industry had in the game. Nuclear energy investments are long-term investments. Even though the AP1000 has bankrupted Westinghouse, a once formidable enterprise, doesn't mean that there aren't other economically viable alternatives ready to fill the void. Lessons will be learned from the economic failure to commercialize the AP1000. I agree with Romm insofar that the age of large and complex new light water reactors is coming to an end. But I think that they will still be built for another decade or so, as many other countries still invest in them.
Nuclear, which is what originally was going to come here and talk about, the problem with nuclear is that its cost curve goes in the wrong direction. We would need a breakthrough and a price on CO2 to save the nuclear industry.
Also note that Romm is a bit reasonable when it comes to the existing fleet of nuclear reactors, because he knows we have to keep them around, as he understands that closing them in the short terms means that renewables would have to pick up the slack, which he knows they cannot. Also, the nuclear industry doesn't need a progressive tax on CO2, although it would certainly help progress the renaissance you are constantly denying. But it does need these so-called breakthroughs, which are actually happening as we speak.
My apologies. This is the Brattle Group analysis. This is the analysis of how much CO2 price would be needed to save the existing nuclear fleet. My apologies on that one. So it turns out that about half of the threatened nuclear fleet could be supported with an average cost per ton of CO2 of below $10 a ton. Not bloody much money at all. And the most expensive would be $75 a ton. So this is just a choice that people are going to have to make. Personally, I would love to extend the lifetime of existing nukes.
Finally, this is the first sensible thing I have heard from you. If we continue down this path together, we will arrive at the same conclusion eventually. Existing nuclear is already incredibly valuable. New light water reactors will be built in major countries like China, India and Russia, and the breakthrough will come in the form of small modular reactors like the molten salt reactor. Why? It is fairly simple because they address all the major issues that have caused companies like Westinghouse to go out of business. Small modular reactors ensure that new units can be manufactured in factories. They have an entirely new and far more simpler safety profile, and they provide more versatility in fuel choices. They also do not need large volumes of water to get cooled. Aside from that, they open up the possibility of cogeneration, which wind turbines and solar panels simply cannot do. And that's why these new reactors will become successful.
And not put so much pressure on the grid and on renewables to solve every single problem in the next 10 years.
If the nuclear industry and the renewable industry don't learn to coexist, or more importantly, to cooperate, they will never be able to outcompete coal, gas, and oil. Not just in an electricity context, but especially from a total energy consumption perspective, where electricity is only 20 to 30% of all the energy we used. Have you already found a credible solution for industrial heat? Do you think that battery electrical vehicles can scale up 100-fold in terms of deployment figures?
But as you can imagine, if half of the existing, already paid for nuclear fleet is unprofitable today, a new nuclear plant makes absolutely no sense.
No one would buy a new AP1000, we can all see that. But consider, for instance, the new scale proposition. Let's do a CapEx calculation per energy unit produced over a lifespan of 60 years at a capacity of 500 megawatts. This would give us a capital expenditure of 1.06 cents per kilowatt hour, which is an entirely different value proposition than the AP1000 would give us. So if we look at the levelized cost of electricity, we see that the new scale small modular reactor can compete with just about anything in the US. And deployment of these units would be perfectly reasonable given the current economic circumstances. And it even gets better when we venture into the realm of the molten salt reactor. Look up Terrestrial Energy and ThorCon Power, for instance. These companies are developing molten salt reactors, which can be deployed easy because they can be built as airplanes or ships. And check out the expected levelized cost of electricity for a ThorCon 1000 megawatt plant. Indonesia is committed and will build these things. And that's nothing to scoff at. It's a free market economy with 250 million people.
And in fact, there is no market economy in the world building a substantial amount of nuclear plants because they make no financial sense. The only ones that are doing it are your China, your India, and your Russia.
So these are the facts as they stand, and that is not taking into account the 36 countries who want to get into the nuclear business because they need cheap and affordable energy, and they won't buy it from France or the United States. They will buy their reactors from China or Russia. Here are the countries who are building one or more reactors at this moment: Argentina, Brazil, Romania, United Arab Emirates, Pakistan, Slovakia, South Korea, Finland, and France. And this is without the 50 or so that are being built in China, India, and Russia, which is something to be envious of because they are truly working on mitigating their negative influence on the climate while simultaneously providing more prosperity for the 2 and something billion people that live there.
Needless to say, there's no board of directors of any utility in this country or any market economy that can possibly take this kind of investment risk in a world where people are building hundreds and hundreds of gigawatts of wind and solar for literally 1/4 this price.
No, you're wrong. And you know that you're wrong. First, it's not thousands. I know you corrected yourself, but it was on your mind anyway. It showed. Yet you still chose to exaggerate the number by stating hundreds, which is plural, and hundreds, again plural, of gigawatts and solar. I suspect that hundreds is at least 200. Well, 200 we haven't managed yet. The 2016 report of the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st century tells us that we are in the 100 range, with 113 gigawatts to be precise, which is a respectable number, but hardly enough to push the demand away from fossil fuels. Secondly, with stagnated increments of 10 to 15 gigawatt per year, we won't reach hundreds before the 2020s.
And the IEA itself, which is a fairly conservative organization, but under their recent leadership, they have gotten better at explaining what the future is. So this is the IEA, International Energy Agency, from November. So by 2030, renewables will be the world's primary power source.
Hold it right there, buddy. You're talking to an academic and highly professional audience. Can someone tell me why no one has stopped you right there on the spot? You're not talking about power. You as a physicist should know the difference between power and energy. You are showing generated electricity figures, which you cannot claim to be a primary power source. That's your first mistake. On top of that, this may be true for electricity, yes, but that's not the only problem we are facing right now. In fact, these 13,000 terawatt hours of hydro, biomass, geothermal, solar and wind hardly scratch the surface in terms of the entire primary energy demand of the world. In fact, it is estimated that in 2030, our primary energy consumption will rise to 717 quadrillion BTU, or 210,000 terawatt hours. So renewables simply aren't going to cut it. But it seems that you are terribly happy with that scenario. I would be very disappointed if both renewables and nuclear wouldn't ramp up to significant enough numbers to offset at least the carbon burning part of the graph you are showing there. Additionally, and this is very important, are you going to tell me that you think that 6,000 terawatt hours of expected solar and wind generation is a lot? You fail to recognize that that graph shows us that more than half of all renewable energy generation will come from hydro and biomass, which is hidden in the other segment of the graph. We can hardly call that substantial. Also, if we will be overtaking coal generation by 2030, we are doing something wrong. The aggregate of solar, wind and nuclear are not enough to offset the current additions of gas and coal. So basically, we're currently caught in a status quo. Yes, you might be right that coal is in the decline, but not as fast as it should be. And gas certainly will be the dominant energy source for at least a couple of decades. So this graph here is hardly cause for optimism. In fact, it makes me feel pessimistic. Want to know why? Here's why. Maintaining the status quo doesn't curb emissions. In fact, if we keep going this route, even when coal additions would stop by 2025 or 2030 and gas additions would stop somewhere beyond that, we are still headed for the +2 degree scenario. Not only that, I shiver when I think about the possible ramifications of the increased acidity of the oceans, simply because we failed to seriously put a stop to emissions. Here is my interpretation of the same Energy Information Administration graph that Romm is showing to the University of Colorado audience. This gives us an idea of the problem ahead. If these projections would be true, renewables would fail to get on par with fossil fuels, which immediately shows you that the claim renewables will be the biggest is absolutely false. You need to create an aggregate view of high carbon and low carbon energy in order to get the correct context. Even if we would couple nuclear to renewables in such a context, we would still be burning more fossil fuels for electricity than we would be getting from low carbon energy sources. This to me is giving a positive spin to something that is hardly cause for optimism. Apart from a technological shift on the demand side, we need to augment both renewable and nuclear deployment speed significantly to seriously affect a change in our fossil fuel consumption rate.
We have an EV deployment miracle. There were no substantial EVs deployed in 2010. We have gone up a curve that looks like this. We're now at 500,000 vehicles a year. What's interesting is that China has decided, just like they decided, hey, solar and wind, that's the technology of the clean future, the carbon-safe future. We're going to spend money to be the leaders in deployment and technology. They're betting the farm on electric vehicles and batteries. So China tripled last year, passing the U.S. Chinese plan is a factor of 10 increase by 2025.
Okay, this raises yet more questions and problems. A factor of 10, from 200,000 to 2 million electrical vehicles built each year. If this is the best we can do, we are not going to punch the lights out on oil for quite a while. It is said that there are about 1 billion cars on the planet. 50 to 60 million new cars are being built each year. The 600,000 figure of 2015 sounds like a lot, but on a global scale it doesn't even register. It's 1% of all the cars built in 2015. Suppose we need 1 billion cars within, say, 25 years. We would need to produce 40 million BEVs in a year. The question is whether we can produce enough batteries to make this possible. Batteries require elements such as cobalt, graphite and lithium, of which current production rates don't facilitate for such an expansion. Subsequently, Romm is going to show us that we can deduce that oil consumption will remain high well up to the 2030s. Where does oil consumption come from? Exactly, vehicles, and cars in particular. And British Petrol projects that oil consumption will continue well up to the 2100s. I suppose it is fair to accept these kinds of projections as long as people keep seeking arguments to stifle nuclear progress. Discounting one of the more potent technologies around doesn't help in defeating a multi-trillion-dollar industry, which is the fossil fuel industry.
And I think the oil path, this is Bernstein research, will probably look like this. So this is the peak around 2030, 2035, and then it comes down. And the reason I know that it's going to keep doing this is because the climate situation is not getting better. You read it, someone was just telling me Boulder is getting a 1,000-year flood every 4 or 5 years, right? So that's not getting better, it's going to get worse. So we will be more desperate in the 2020s, and we will ramp up deployment even more. Technology costs will come down even more. So this is a transition. I was speaking to Al Gore at a speaker training. I was interviewing him, and he said, this is a transition like the Industrial Revolution and the Information Revolution combined, because it has the scale of the Industrial Revolution, but the speed of the Information Revolution.
If we regard this in technological terms, we may call this an Apollo moment for mankind. We have to overcome something which we've created ourselves and depend upon. Fossil fuel usage has to be curtailed in order for this planet to remain habitable. Aside from that, we would also be saving lives, as we would be removing hazardous emissions and thus cleaning up the atmosphere. I have to show you, Joe Romm, and other potential onlookers exactly why we can expect a nuclear energy renaissance. The first misconception we need to get out of the way is that this renaissance will be based on the light water reactor concept. Granted, Russia, China, India, Korea, and a dozen of other countries will be investing heavily in light water reactors for another decade or so. However, in the meantime, we will see the emergence of the molten salt reactor. Yes, there will be many other designs as well, but none offer the complete suite of superior augments when compared to contemporary reactors. Here we see a simple comparison between a generic light water reactor and a molten salt reactor. It should be apparent from the beginning that they are almost polar opposites in almost all regards. The liquid fuel offers a far higher fuel efficiency. The liquid fuel is a molten salt with a high freezing point, meaning that if there is no fission, it literally wants to cool down. Because the fuel is a liquid, it can be drained in the case of an emergency, which is a safety feature that works always, thanks to gravity. This means that all fuel can be drained into special tanks. that contain no moderator. And because there is no moderator, there are no slowed down neutrons. Hence, there is no fission. Another option is to use a buffer salt, which can also extract heat from the core. There are two features that stand out. The first one is that the molten salt reactor core unit is so compact that you can build it on an assembly line and transport it via the road. This is a game changer in the world of nuclear energy, where all present nuclear reactors were assembled on site from extremely heavy single-forged pressure vessels. The molten salt reactor is a modular concept, which means that you can build units that are plug and play. You don't need to do the entire plumbing on site. Plumbing and testing can be done on the assembly line. Modules arrive at the reactor facility and are plugged in, connected to each other, and form a functional power generating unit. The second feature that brings about a very sizable market opportunity is the high temperature at which the molten salt reactors operate. This makes it possible to use such a reactor not just for creating electricity, but also to be used as a thermal heat platform for industrial processes. Additionally, the molten salt reactor is the perfect match for desalination and fuel production. These features enable this reactor concept, which has been around for more than 5 decades, to change the nuclear industry as we know it. It won't happen overnight, but we may expect it to happen in the 2020s. We have arrived at the conclusion of this video. Joe Romm likes to keep extant reactors around, but doesn't like there to be new ones. The argument that there won't be new ones is demonstrably false. Aside from that, we can show that his bias in favor of renewables is overly optimistic and doesn't help in deep decarbonization.